Right, welcome back after the pause to the second part of this seminar. And I would like to welcome you as well to Klint. I'm very happy to be here myself after 5 months in Sweden because of the corona pandemic. We have those challenges, as Sören talked about in his great presentation. And I think it's very transformative times in many ways for us all, but one thing that we really appreciate and that we are learning all over the world is how to meet online instead. We do miss our physical possibilities, but we get access to all these seminars, online conferences and so on that suddenly, or even concerts and other things that suddenly are free to everyone, and including those NDE experiences we did really appreciate. I think that we that have studied cosmology for quite some time, we find it extremely rewarding to listen to all these personal stories from different parts of the world that really confirm some of the principles that Martinus tells us about in his cosmic analyses. So I will continue now, as you can see, with the title with this presentation and talk about one aspect of this evolution. We will stick to the keywords compassion, evolution, reincarnation, and the meaning of suffering that Sören mentioned at the end of his lecture. And as you can see on this quote from Martinus, he says, or he states, how could our faculty for compassion or love be developed if we never ever experienced suffering? And that might seem sort of self-evident in a way, but when we come to think of it, it certainly gives all the suffering and pain another meaning. And it gives us perspectives of time that you have seen, and we will come back to that. And one thing that I find very inspiring when listening to those people who tell about their near-death experiences is that, I think it was a doctor actually in a German film that said that their capacity or their compassion seemed to have grown after this experience. I think you mentioned that, Sören, which I think is amazing because we realize, as you also mentioned earlier, that, and I have learned as well, that we learn that people are more or less stable in their personalities, and some people seem to be more compassionate than others. And suddenly those people have extremely transformative experiences and come back, and they seem to have a huge extent of compassion for other people, for animals, for their own body, sometimes depending on the circumstances. So then arises the question, how do we develop compassion? And why do we have these different levels of compassion? And perhaps we can find some answers, or we will find some answers in Martinus's analysis, and we can only go into some aspects here now. But I am by profession a language teacher and a linguist, so I'm interested in words, and I just started thinking about the word compassion. It's not that old compared to human history. It seems to be perhaps 2,000 years or so, a little longer. Comes from Greek, and it means in English, but it's more or less the same in the other European languages. It's the only languages I can tell about. It means feeling of sorrow or deep tenderness for one who is suffering or experiencing misfortune. So it's really a powerful word and a powerful feeling. And if we look at the etymology roots of it. It comes from Latin, com, that means with, and from party, to suffer. It's sort of a verb stem somehow. Probably you who listen to this know that better than I do, but the basic meaning would be to suffer with. So compassion has to do with to suffer with someone, and I think that's also a very powerful image. And even more interesting perhaps is that it comes from the Greek word sympatheia, which means originally another meaning than compassion. Really, it means sort of that you're connected to everything. Usually symbolizes that things are connected. So you can see that the word has to do with suffering as well, that you can experience somebody else's suffering, but also the sense of being connected. And I gather this information from a wonderful website called etymonline.com. And then just to continue a little on the linguistic path, I won't go deeper into it, but if you look at some related words, I mean, no word is an island. Sometimes you say you always have to look at other words. There are, of course, synonyms like sympathy or empathy or pity, commiseration, and other words in that direction. And we know that those words are also used, for example, in the Bible. I'm not really a great Bible reader. I don't know if I have been in a previous life, but I'm not now. But I just sort of stumbled upon some Bible quotations that I thought were interesting too, because when you relate to those NDE experiences or near-death experiences, they tell about deep spiritual experiences, and they also talk about God, even if they say that God is much bigger than the God you learned about in school. But then the word compassion is often used. We are taught to be compassionate in the old religions. So you can see in this quote, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Martinus would say that's a misunderstanding of Jesus' role. We could go into that later on, perhaps. But the main thing is that we are sort of encouraged to develop those talents. And then in another quote, praise be to the Lord and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort. And then I also realized when I sort of experimented with this that you can't really exchange the word compassion that easily. If you would say, praise be to the God, the Father of sympathy, somehow, or the Father of empathy, or the Father of pity, I don't know. It's very different how we react to those terms at any rate, but I think I would feel slightly insecure or perhaps a little sort of empty if somebody said, well, it's the Father of sympathy. Because it would be okay. Father who sympathizes with you but sort of leaves us on our own to do this. Or the Father of pity, he pities us, but what then? So you can see that compassion is a strong word, I think, and has this deep meaning of I suffer with you and I also wish to help you. I think that would be the difference perhaps between the other words that are related. They also use the word tender-hearted in some translation varieties, which indicates that compassion is grounded in the heart, which I think is important too. So the faculty of compassion, as it's called also in Martinus's works, would be the same as real neighborly love, and a very strong word that I think, an image that has come to us in lots of different varieties. And as I said, it has this meaning of not just sympathizing, not just liking you, but love in the sense of being with you all the time. And Martinus gives us then this analysis of compassion, and as Sören just talked about, all our talents, like piano playing and so on, have been trained, have been practiced in previous lives. But perhaps we don't usually think that about mental talents, since we don't usually, at least not in Christian traditions, we usually not count on reincarnation and the possibility of practicing compassion, like you do in school. Now you have practiced 1 life, 2 lives, 3 lives, many lives. And some people perhaps are experts on compassion. Jesus Christ is lifted as the big example, but I think the way we were taught in school, now Sweden is a very secularized country, but we were still taught a little about Christianity. It's like that he was born the perfect person, the perfect Son of God, the perfect compassionate person. And there's no way that we can learn that. That's why we needed him, so that God could forgive us for not being as compassionate and loving as he is. And Martinus, of course, gives us another perspective, that compassion is something that we learn. And he also tells us it's based on past memories. And we will look at some more quotes and some bits of his analysis when he shows that. And here you can see another symbol. Søren talked about his 100 symbols. You can find them on our page, martinus.dk. He has his own symbol language in a way. So you can't go into all the details in those seminars, I think, but you recognize the triune principle, it's called, isn't it? Here as well, that actually this is, even if it perhaps looks abstract, all these sections here are a living being. You could see it's a living being developing through this spiral cycle. Here you would see one cycle then, so you would start here. Oops, here it is. In the plant kingdom, going on, plant kingdom being symbolized by red, and then the animal kingdom being symbolized by orange. And here you see, I think you can perceive here a white line. And here approximately, he says, is where the human being, terrestrial human beings, as it calls us, a little bit, sort of an interesting word. Terrestrial human being starts here. So we're still in the animal kingdom. You see the earth, he's very pedagogical. And you see that the goal will be that the golden key, so to say, the great birth, the cosmic consciousness that we will all receive. But in order to do that, we must develop compassion. And what he says, which is very interesting, is not only that we develop compassion, being based on past memories as human beings. We can imagine that. We go through suffering and we develop compassion. But he even says it starts even earlier in the animal kingdom with real animals. And I took a short walk this morning and met a cat, a nice little cat, which was very cute. But I thought if I would have a chat with that cat and just talk to it and have a conversation about killing mice or not, I don't think, or I'm quite sure as you are, it wouldn't be possible, because the cat wouldn't sort of being able to speculate on the capacity of compassion in that way. That would be in a cartoon. It wouldn't be for real. If the cat would need a mouse, it would just kill it and take it. We know that. It's based on instinct. So even if it's cute, even if it's nice, we know there's a difference between us and the cat. But what Martinus says is that it starts in the kingdom, in the animal kingdom. Because there is so much suffering. And we know that when animals are killed, they cry out. And he mentions that many times, this outcry actually has some kind of purpose, because nothing is purposeless, that goes beyond just sort of physical survival. Because if we just go physical survival, that cry would be useless, because nobody would listen to you. If this is a sort of running animal in a herd, the others wouldn't stop. And this I don't know what it is, a jaguar, puma, I don't know. No expert on animals, will certainly not sort of stop and think, no, I don't think I'll kill you. That won't happen. A lion is a lion, he says, and a lamb is a lamb. And those principles are always valid. But it does cry out. It's an instinct. We know that. The cat that I met would cry out if something would threaten its survival. And we cry out. We pray. He says that this cry is the first beginning of prayer, actually. And he also says, and we'll come back to that, that this is the very first sensation of sort of a mental existence. Because after a while, when the animal has experienced this many, many times, it creates memories of suffering, of pain. And of course, that takes a long time before that is created. And it means that it can start remembering that, and then being even cleverer when it comes to avoiding being killed. And so actually, later on, that would be the same as then the basis for also developing compassion, because we would recognize it in other animals. In the beginning, it perhaps just an automatic recognition, perhaps not so much compassion as just recognition that animal is hurt and you want to flee perhaps. But later on, and especially in humans, it awakens automatically after a while, the need for help. So he says, in reality, compassion is nothing less than unconscious recognition in the memory of experienced suffering. So it's important to realize those steps. You experience suffering, you store that as memories, you can collect those memories, and then that is the basis for recognition when the situation happens again. But very important, this is a baby, so we sort of leave the animal kingdom and the cat right now. Very important, we don't remember all our past lives, and I don't think we want to. I don't know, I think some of you who are listening maybe have listened to all these stories of past lives and trying to do some, what are they called? Past life regressions. Exactly. And I thought about that too. It seems so very interesting to speculate if you have been a princess in Egypt, or if you have been murdered in London, or whatever interesting, or some person that you have met, if you have met that person before. But just imagine being able to remember 10 lives. That would be a huge effort every day to live, because we can't even remember all the details of our own life. So if that baby would remember 10 lives when it was being born, it would probably not be sort of the basis for it would just be unpractical. So I think it's quite good the way it is. But he says that memories appear in two phases, because we do experience lots of things every day. And when we experience suffering and pain, for example, being killed, that creates a memory with clear details of a phenomenon. Also interesting that those people who experience near-death experiences seem to have a much better memory, for at least for a period of time, being able to remembering the whole life, that the sort of life film or life story, but also other things, details. So of course we store the memories. They are stored somewhere in our superconsciousness, as Sören mentioned. And then Martinus says, and it's somewhat simplified here, that the experience remains in the consciousness, and that would be then in the superconsciousness, only as a knowledge of the phenomenon's principle or essence. That means, which I guess is the good thing, we don't remember all the things when we died as an animal or as a human being, as a primitive human being, and all the times that we ourselves caused suffering for others. But we remember the principle. It has left sort of an essence or some kind of kernel, and that means that we can recognize it. And that is the basis for compassion, he says. And you can see that the quote is from the Book of Life, where he goes into this. So the little newborn baby here isn't newborn in the sense that it brings nothing with it, and that would also be quite useless. Because some of you are teachers perhaps, and just imagine if you would teach the same class every year and just start from scratch every year in mathematics, for example, like you have, Solveig, taught mathematics. If you just start from scratch with the same group, that would be the cycle that would never move forward, and it's not like that. It's a spiral cycle. So, of course, that baby brings a lot of experience with him or her. I don't know what gender it is. But it remains as an essence, and probably, if I interpret it correctly, we have a lot in our unconsciousness that we don't, much more than we know, much more experience than we know, and probably something that we perhaps don't even remember, but it is there somewhere, it is stored. And just to see some concrete examples of that, when it comes to compassion, I think we take it for granted, but as we said, it's something that has been trained and developed. You can just see here 2 examples. Martinus says, well, you will feel your fellow suffering, you can fully comprehend it. And the picture to the left is a young American girl who has played a baseball game, I think, American game, and being comforted because she has lost. You can sort of feel the despair when she has lost. And the little boy, it might be her little brother, we don't know, just has this automatic reflex, but she needs to be comforted. He doesn't stop thinking, what should I do, or something like that. It's just automatic. I would say that's an automatic talent that has been developed. If somebody is sad, you want to comfort that person, especially if you know him, you know her. And the same situation would be to the right. We see an elderly person, actually a 90-year-old grandmother. It might seem a happy picture, and it is in a way, but it's said in that context that she's 90 years old, she has a celebration, but she can't meet her grandchildren, nor her children. She can only see them on the phone. And you can see that the nurse, and I think that's quite touching, it's a small thing, but it's touching, because she automatically sort of just puts a hand on her shoulder and is close to her, and has that physical presence which that elderly lady can't have at the moment. And you can see because of the face mask that it's because of the pandemic. And again, I think that's something we do automatically, and something that many people have suffered from during the pandemic, that we have to refrain from those automatic talents. That when somebody is in pain, when somebody is sad, we want to comfort them, we want to touch them or be close to them or comfort them in different ways. And we can't do that. And that's very educational as well, for other reasons, because of course there's a meaning to that too. But I think that the main point is compassion is based in our faculty of feeling, and it's just something that we do. And we want to help in both those cases. The situation just sort of made those people want to help, which seems quite natural, but it's interesting to think about it, because of course we don't always do that. It would be nice to think that we were finished human beings, but we know that from Paul, I think it's called in English, in the Bible, he says, I don't do what I want to do, I do what I don't want to do, and we have those two natures. So we have our old talents from the animal kingdom. They are very strong. We have that we had that A, B, and C knowledge that you remember. And of course, we have many, many C talents perhaps from the Roman Empire. I think this is probably some kind of reenactment, because it doesn't look that real. But 2,000 years ago, we would bring our children to watch people just fighting each other to death, or seeing animals killing people, lots of blood, lots of violence, and that would be entertainment. And that is an indication that we have developed, because we don't do that today. If we would see something like that today, our nervous system probably couldn't stand it. And we certainly wouldn't bring our children to do that. We have developed those talents. You can see female football players in the row, so it's more civilized today, but of course there's still some kind of energy of gravity, of fighting instinct here that we need to outlive. And also, interesting last, of course, also women. I think that Solveig will talk more about men and women in this process later on. But what Martinus says, the ability to have compassion is based on memory images of former experiences, but it's obvious, he says, and that's something he very often tells us, which is comforting. It's obvious that it can't be perfect in the first stage of his creation. It's like practicing to play the piano. If somebody would expect you to do that at once, and you can't, you would just give up and say, I will never be a pianist. But of course you need to practice, and not just one life, but many lives. And it's the same with compassion and all the other human talents. So I also gather that psychiatrists and so on often discuss that question. Why do we have those different capacities for compassion? Why are there people who seem to feel no compassion at all? And why do we sometimes seem to regress? Do you say that? Regress, to go back into more primitive states. We think we are very humane, but you can see now the coronavirus has sort of given birth to some kind of corona nationalism, in a way, where we fight, we want to have the vaccine, and we want to protect your own citizens first, and so on, and many borders are closed. And he calls that, which is an interesting word, he says that if strongly retarding forces do not interfere, and that will be an individual, he will react in the interest of relieving his fellow being's suffering. So the normal thing would be to comfort somebody who suffers, because we have practiced that so long and we have suffered so much. But there would be some forces. For example, the debate about boat refugees to Europe. Before the coronavirus, we talked a lot about the Mediterranean being the most dangerous and lethal boundary in the world. Thousands of people drowning there every year, and people talked a lot about it, and actually they still drown, but we don't talk as much about it, probably because of those retarding forces. But there could be other reasons. We could discuss this later on, perhaps, or you might have examples, like peer pressure in school. Martinus talks about the importance of thinking about what you eat or drink and so on. But if all your peers, especially when you're young, live in a certain way, it might be difficult to stick to your own level of compassion. You might feel it's wrong to eat meat, for example, but perhaps you do it because you want to adapt. And at a larger level, then group pressure, herd instinct, as I said, nationalism. It seems to be very often that we are inclined to feel we are part of a group, and then we have another group, like Swedish citizens being 10 million people in the world, and then the rest is one group, like the out group, and we are the in group. And that's just an instinct. But with Martinus's analysis, we can understand that and don't judge that, but we can be aware of it. That's an old talent. We don't need it any longer. It actually stops us from expanding our capacity of compassion. And again, I think it's so interesting that those people who experience a near-death experience just seem to have an overflow of compassion, sometimes even so much that they are so sensitive to other people's thoughts and feelings that they just need to stop it because it would be too much. So that's something, again, we need to practice. I mentioned regression through fear and self-preservation instinct, obviously materialized through the corona pandemic as well, but we recognize it in many situations if we think about it. Alcohol and drugs, as I understand it, very often have the effect of interfering with your normal sense of compassion and love and other things, like judgment, for example. And again, then that's a more basic analysis. All of us, practically, almost all of us living on Earth, have an imbalance between our capacity of feeling and our intelligence, and we could also have that in different areas. But we could remember that Martinus said that the ability to feel compassion, and we also saw the examples from the Bible and so on, is in its essence rooted in our suffering experiences, has something to do with our heart in a way, and not just with intellect, even if we need this balance between intellect and feeling. And then we could just come back to phase 2 of our memories, and we see this symbol again that Sören showed, that we know that we store our talents in this super consciousness, which means that we store the essence of our memories here. But if we haven't experienced this kind of suffering, and I think it has the example of, for example, a cancer illness, severe illness here, we can't mobilize it in our unconscious memory even. I think most people have had many cases of suffering and illnesses, but it could still be that we have different paths, and some things we might never have experienced if you have never been a refugee, or if you have never been homeless. We could just walk past a homeless person and think, okay, that's sad, but I can't do anything about it. But another person just can't bring herself or himself to just walk past, just feels I need to do something, I can at least give a friendly word, I just can't just walk past because I know that that person is suffering. And that is because the second person then has this memory material. But if we don't, and it's important that Martinus stresses that we should never judge that, because if we don't have it stored here, then we can't really manifest it. It seems unrealistic, and then such people, he says, can appear. He shouldn't say old. He should say cold, cold and unfeeling in that area. That's a typing mistake. Cold and unfeeling in that area, even if they could be quite intelligent in some other areas. I remember myself when perhaps you meet people who are extremely intelligent. It could be doctors or business people and so on. They could also be quite tolerant. For example, when it comes to homosexual people, sexuality is a topic we will come back to, or other things, religious inclinations. So if they just buy my products, they could be homosexual or Arabs or whatever. But if we talk to them about bridging the gap between rich and poor, then the same person might be quite callous and cold. Say, well, I can't do anything about Indian people being poor. It's not my problem. So then I think that might explain, these analyses might explain that in some areas we have lots of material and we have logical thinking, and in other areas, in this sense. We don't have any memories, not enough at least. So he says, the more we have suffered, the more sympathy and compassion will arise in our consciousness in that second phase. And I will wrap it up soon, but just show briefly another symbol here, and won't go into details, where he also shows us how important it is to understand mankind's various capacity for compassion and love. In this symbol, yellow symbolizes feeling and green intelligence. And without taking the details, we could see that, let's see if I can find my mouse, some people here who would be inspired by the new impulse, New World impulse, which would be the spiritual science, people who are no longer inspired by traditional religions, because will be the lower part of the symbol, but it would just stick to those categories, which are categories. There are many, many varieties. But there would be some few people who have a perfect balance, or almost a perfect balance, between feeling and intelligence. And they would actually be able to manifest the best compassion, because they would also know what's the best thing to do if they want to be in contact with providence. They would also probably spend a lot of time with communication with God in order to know what's the best thing to do in difficult situations. And then he says that some other people have an overweight of feeling. And if you have an overweight of feeling, perhaps also combined with instinct and energy of gravity as we have, that might manifest itself in intolerance and so on. And if we have an overweight of intelligence, which is especially relevant for compassion, that would mean the same as we can see in this quote. He says here, if a human being has as yet developed only as far as being able to understand its neighbor's suffering with his brain, but not with his heart, it will feel no need whatsoever to help its neighbor in need. It's somewhat freely translated here, or summarized here. And I think that too can be that an intelligent person could recognize that the world is unjust and that we need to help other people, but could sort of have a limit. Well, I have my life, I want a comfortable life. And he goes on to say that those beings usually think more about their own family, their own children, and so on. So in that sense, the only thing that can develop and that will develop that person's compassion, capacity to feel compassion, would be your own individual sufferings, not any kind of reading or logical thinking in that sense. That also helps with other things. And I remember one of these near-death experiences is what a Swiss girl been interviewed on a German TV channel called Thanatos. Very interesting. She told about what she experienced when she was operated on. It was sort of a difficult operation where she almost died, very sort of critical. And she said that she saw one woman who, I'm not saying that this is true for everyone, it might be a little gender bias, but this is one case. She saw one woman because she could perceive all the thoughts. That was the interesting part. She was hovering above her body, didn't understand what was happening, had a typical near-death experience, and she could see those people's thoughts. And she saw that one woman was very concerned and worried about her. And then she saw that the others, I think there were men operating, were very concentrated, very focused. And she also said that one of them had football in his head. It was just sort of interesting, because it's a detail that also makes these stories so credible, because you couldn't just find that up. I mean, imagine that. And probably he was a good surgeon, even if he was thinking about football, but I was thinking about it might be a little the same. Very focused on doing a good job, but not perhaps too much bothered with compassion in the sense that the woman was in that situation. So that's just an example that we are different. But we will develop towards the same goal. And here you see, and that's the last symbol you will see here, where Martinus shows us what he calls the principle of world redemption. But you could say that he shows us this spiral cycle just from another angle, focuses on another aspect, and this will be our spiritual development. Here again, in the beginning, mixed with a lot of, or just dominated by a lot of energy of gravity, as it calls the orange color. That's animal instincts, the instinct of power, where compassion would be very far away, and where we would be inspired by religious impulses, where actually there would even be perhaps men where you would sacrifice people and so on. And you would just follow that. And later on, through our own suffering, through our memories, you see that it gradually turns into yellow, which then symbolizes energy of feeling, but also here the humane religions. And we have those three rays here: Christianity. He says it's Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam, but there are a lot more. So again, it's just a symbol. And the main thing is to see that slowly, everybody, it doesn't matter what impulse you belong to, or what tradition you have lived in on earth. Everybody, every being moves towards the same goal, which is that golden key, that glimpse, that spiritual science, or the true God, the real Godhead, that sort of everything ends up in, and that we have our individual variation on our way there, as I said, but on the whole we follow this huge part. And if we go back to that feeling of compassion, going back to the word sympatheia, that we are interconnected with everything, I think we can see that this is also what Martinus tells us that our development is, and what those people having a near-death experiences can also glimpse, that we are really connected. And this is the way we will go. And just to see that formulated in another way by a poet that you probably recognize, he puts it in a beautiful way, because, I mean, nobody wants to experience pain and suffering like that normally. We want to experience happiness and enjoyment. But he says, and it's beautiful, your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. And in that single line, he brings in the balance, I think, at least I interpret it that way, of logic, of intelligence and feeling, but also of understanding, of seeing the reason behind all this. That reincarnation would give you the key, why it is like that. But you need the pain in order to see what life is like for other people. And I know that many people have witnessed and told us that even if something has been very, very painful, then they realize after that period they wouldn't want to miss it, because it was such a valuable experience and they had learned so much and they had changed as people. So it's painful, but it's valuable. And I just go on to the last one here. And he summarizes it, and we let Martinus summarize it until we have a little pause again. That we will go on. We need to have those experiences of suffering in those areas when we are not finished. We can't avoid it, even if we wish it. But he says, when we feel compassion in all areas of life, I can recommend, by the way, a lecture by Mary McGovern, who couldn't be here today. She has a wonderful lecture called Widening, the Circus of Compassion, I think, where she talks about all the living beings that we should need to practice compassion. It's not just our old grandmother or boys, but it's also animals, our microbeings in the body, our planet, and so on. When we feel compassion in all those areas, he says, it becomes total love and identical with the eternally leading and guiding forces of the universe. And then we will actually reach our goal. But we have time for practicing, and in the meantime, we also need breaks and pauses. So thank you so much for your attention, and we'll have a 10-minute break again. Jonas will tell us what time it is and when the break will stop, I think. So or if you're going to help me?
Until 15:40.
Until 15:40. Okay. So we hope you stay with us, and I hope that you ask questions in the chat, by the way, or by email. So because you could always, if you'd like to share some personal experiences, anything that you would like us to discuss in this last part of the seminar where we will talk together. But we will have a break, and then you will listen to Solveig's presentation after the break. So thank you.